Hello, folks. I'm Duncan Hunter.
And I'm Duncan Hunter.
And today we're going to talk about three borders: the Ukrainian border, the Israeli border, and the southern border of the United States, which is only about 15 miles away from us, where we sit today in San Diego, California. Now, you know, these three borders are very interconnected right now because there's a fight in Congress over sending money to Ukraine, which we've been supporting very strongly, sending money for defensive actions by Israel in light of the Hamas attacks across their border. And of course, the very compelling argument that we need to have a controlled border in the southern boundary of the United States with Mexico. We've got about 8 to 10,000 people a day in the last week or so coming across that border. The United States Marine Corps is about 172,000 people. That means around every 20 days we have coming into the United States illegally, without vetting, about the size of the United States Marine Corps. And that is very, very concerning to lots of members of Congress and lots of Americans. And the question is, when we put together the next aid package, are we going to include in the package for Ukraine and the package for Israel also a package for our own border by hiring more Border Patrol agents, putting in more double fences like the one we have in San Diego, and doing all the things that are necessary to control the border, and maybe even having a pause in immigration coming across that southern border. So we're going to talk about those three borders, but with us, before his phone dies in Albuquerque, New Mexico, is Dr. Robert Hunter, who is an extraordinary scientist. He was President Reagan's Director of Energy Research. He's the guy that invented the Excimer laser and founded the Western Research Corporation. He knows missiles. Robert Hunter also happens to be my brother. I proudly had a 1.7 grade average, but he did a lot better. And a guy who really understands missiles and missile defense. So we want to talk to him first about Ukraine, because he thinks the Ukrainian war could go badly for Ukraine and ultimately for the United States. So let's see if he's on the line here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Bob, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here, Doc.
Okay, you mentioned that while we're sending lots of materiel, and have been for the past several years, to Ukraine, we're not giving them what they need to win. And you also said another thing. You said that one of your great friends, Dr. Greg Canavan, who was there, a senior fellow at Los Alamos National Laboratory, had a good line. He said that the Russian nuclear capability has intimidated us to some degree in terms of giving Ukraine the weapons it needs. It's also intimidated Ukraine to some degree in terms of its operations, because it understands that if a mightily provoked Russia could at some point use those weapons. But what do you think we have to do, and we should do in the coming year and in the next several aid packages, to enable the Ukrainians to win that war?
Well, I think that one thing we have to understand is that the U.S. aid is aid out of our own weapon systems, which were put together in a past historic time, looking at a past historic enemy construct. Now, what the Ukrainians face today is different. People talk about, well, this is really like trench warfare. Well, I don't think it is. I think that you've got an asymmetry. You've got the Russians that have got enormous defenses built up already that's been allowed to be put in place. And I don't think the Ukrainians have that same depth of defense. So if the Russians were able to penetrate the Ukrainian front, you might see a very rapid degradation of the situation. And consequently, I think first we need to ensure a really steady and strong supply of the existing weaponry that we have so they can sustain their efforts in the near future. Now, secondly, I think it's really important that we understand that the war is evolving quite rapidly as to how it takes place. The Ukrainians have done very well in introducing and using drones for example, a lot of small drones. So my proposal would be that you give the Ukrainians money, and they can decide whether they want to spend it on our military systems, or whether they want to do like joint R&D with our own contractors or on their own to rapidly develop the most effective systems for the kind of warfare that we actually have today. In other words, when we put all these systems together a long time ago, we were facing various constructs, which is what's happening today inside of the Ukraine. And consequently, the people that are actually fighting the war will have the best idea about how best to provide new kinds of technologies to afford them the advantage they're going to need if they're going to survive and sustain their ongoing operations.
So you're saying essentially the Ukrainians have been offered a menu of weapon systems, and we know, for example, they wanted the Javelin early on, which was a tank killer, which President Trump gave them in some number, and the Biden administration has followed on and giving them. We've given them some armor, we've given them some artillery and lots of rounds, but you think that they should be able to create their own menu of what they need to handle the Russian systems that are being thrown at them?
Absolutely. And I furthermore think it's important that at this juncture, it's not a question of is Congress going to appropriate something or not, but it really is a question of making sure they can defend themselves against the growing Russian power. The Russians are learning how to manufacture drones. They're attacking in force, and they have an enormous artillery advantage today in the Ukraine. So the Ukraine ought to be able to do R&D so it can figure out how to basically negate the Russian advantages that they have on the battlefield.
Now, do you
The real battlefield over there today is the problem.
If I may,
And
I
the
think
Ukrainians are the ones that are best positioned to be able to deal with it. Now, we have extraordinary capabilities in the U.S. military, groups like SOCOM and the Air Force, Army, etc. And I would propose that Ukraine be given money and the authority to engage whatever parts of the U.S. military establishment it cares to develop the technology for the kind of war they're actually fighting.
so. This
Not
sounds
the kind
good.
of war we might think it should be or want to be or was in the past.
Bobby, that sounds good, but I would say all of the gadgetry and the drones and figuring out how to fight in this new construct is interesting, but the Ukrainians need air superiority. The big difference between this war and all the wars that we prepared for and all the gear that we gave Ukraine, that was for the United States to be able to fight under air superiority. I mean, that was it, period, end of story. Unless we have air superiority, we haven't gone in, period. I think that's what's changed. The Ukrainians don't have air superiority. We have not given the Ukrainians the ability to have air superiority. The Europeans haven't either. We've been lagging on it. We're going to next year. So I think that's the big difference. You can do all the drone stuff you want to, but if you have 100 F-16s in the rotation,
Well, I agree with you.
you're going to
quite
be shooting down
strongly,
some
Duncan.
Russian stuff.
See, the issue there, remember, what I said was you ought to give the Ukrainians money and let them buy what they want from the U.S. military.
That's never going to happen politically, though. No one's going to allow the
In the near future,
Ukrainians.
they need to buy what they want so they can sustain at least their position.
But the problem is,
You
Bobby,
run
the U.S.
risk,
taxpayer is
again,
not going to
they
give them
don't
money.
have the defensive depth the Russians have built up. So you run the risk, if it gets to the point where the Russians are able to breach the lines, then they could make real inroads. And consequently, I think the air superiority is very desirable.
Hey, Bob, Duncan's making a point.
I would
though,
say it's
that
more than
you need to
desirable, it's
respond to.
necessary. Air superiority is necessary, not just desirable. It's the only way that the Ukrainians could progress and push the Russians out of Ukraine is air superiority.
Well, then the Ukrainians ought to be given enough money so they can buy enough equipment to get air superiority.
What would that consist of, Bob, in terms of aircraft and anti-aircraft capability?
Well, I think Duncan is better positioned to answer that. He was an artillery officer.
But you were an Air Force officer.
And today the artillery is a major element of the Russian defense over there.
Bobby,
And
you
he
were
was
an
a
Air
ground
Force
combat
officer.
and what you're seeing is a lot of ground combat. So I think the question, Duncan, is when you say air superiority is necessary, what do you think would be the best mixture that they could get?
I was Marine artillery officer, Bobby, which means that they just took my crayons away. You, on the other hand, are a nuclear physicist who was actually in the Air Force. So I would swing that question right back to you, my friend.
Well, there are no nuclear-powered airplanes over there. So, in essence, if you want air superiority in today's world, you're going to need surface-to-air system or air-to-air system superiority, so you can knock down the Russian airplanes. And that means fighters of our kind with Abrams, AIM-9Xs, and current air-to-air capabilities. Those fighters also have really good radars, and they can give them a good situational awareness over the battlefield and provide guidance for where to shoot. So I would say fighters with ESA radars and a lot of air-to-air on them, and you could also use drones or something of that nature if you want to maintain an aerial system with constant persistence that could be vectored in with the fighters' radars. So in other words, our fighters can give really good situational awareness over a battlefield, probably unmatched in the world. And using that to help vector the fighters that the Ukrainians would have and use the air-to-air systems that we have, I think would be a very good start in obtaining air superiority over the battlefield.
Let me go to another war where there is air superiority on the side of the pro-U.S. forces. That's the Israel-Hamas conflict, and obviously Israel has lots of has total air superiority.
Total air superiority.
But you know, I read one very disturbing thing today, and that was that from the Institute for the Study of War was a particular ground operation occurred on the 12th, in which in house-to-house fighting, a squad of IDF forces, Israeli forces, were ambushed and presumably took heavy casualties. They sent in a reaction force. That reaction force also took heavy casualties. Ultimately, they got everybody out, but I think even a battalion commander and several company commanders were killed in making the extraction operation, which kind of refocuses us on the fact that when you do house-to-house fighting, which they're having to do in some of those cities in Gaza, the advantage is really to the defender, because when that team comes in, whether it's Israelis or Americans that come through that door, the bad guys have got their weapons up, they get the first shot, and maybe this to some degree is a testament that they're not just knocking down buildings which risk civilian casualties, but they're going door to door, they are taking casualties, and yet the Iron Dome, that is the air defense that Israel put up after we started working with them on missile defense, that Iron Dome has been fairly reliable. And you pointed out that the Iron Dome has handled a lot of the rockets that Hamas sent into Israel. And now they've actually taken down, as I understand, I think you told me the other day, a ballistic missile, probably a Scud type missile, a low-end missile. Is that accurate?
Yes, there have been two Arrow intercepts, I think, of missiles coming
an Arrow
from
is the Israeli
direction of
missile.
Yemen. And those would have been missiles of a very high velocity nature. One of the intercepts, I believe, was actually outside the atmosphere, and that is the first operational intercept of a theater ballistic missile that's ever taken place in combat, to the best of my knowledge. So that system has worked really well. They've also, with an F-35, have shot down a cruise missile that was attacking Israel, and that's also a first, an actual shoot down of a cruise missile using, like I said, the really good radars that we have on those fighters. So the Israelis have produced good technical stuff. With regard to the combat in Gaza that you mentioned, Duncan, you know, the usual model is Stalingrad. When you get into these house-to-house combats in urban areas, the average distance for combat, I think, in Stalingrad was measured as a few tens of feet. So they're very close in. Once you get into that kind of combat, the exchange ratios typically are 1-to-1. Both sides have the same, submachine gun types of armaments, and they're very difficult.
What pathway would you say we take moving past the Gaza operation with respect to advancing our missile defense capability, or the capability of taking down ballistic missiles, whether they're launched from Gaza or maybe at some point launched from the party in interest here, which probably moved Hamas to make the attack in the first place, and that's of course Iran, which is trying to move toward nuclear systems. What kind of action should we take to counterweight that?
Well, you're seeing the same complications, Doug, you will see in that situation that will arise over and over again in the future when you have an actual nuclear party. Let's say Iran gets to be nuclear. Then what you're going to see is a diminution of the flexibility and types of munitions that we will, for example, provide to the Israelis and that the Israelis are allowed to use. So until you can develop an effective missile defense, you're not going to be able to have complete freedom to even use your conventional forces. And consequently, the missile defense area, it's a difficult area to work in. The Israelis have been very successful in the efforts you mentioned. But again, that can be done, I think, from fighters can fire air-to-air systems at missiles. There's a variety of systems you can think of that are new, but without eventually solving that problem to a high degree, that is stopping the long-range missiles that can deliver nukes, you're going to leave the other parties with vetoes over what you can and can't do on the battlefield with your own conventional forces.
Okay, well that takes us back. So Duncan, that takes us back to your first laydown here, where you challenged Bob. I think
I didn't
probably
challenge him. You were asking him more specifically. I think
Yeah.
we've built our entire systems to have air superiority. Right?
Well, that's true.
That's what we're.
A famous saying that was always told us on the Armed Services Committee from the time I got on it in 1980 until I left, probably you heard it too, very proudly the Air Force would tell you that to that point there had never been an American killed by air fire, by fire from an airborne platform, meaning an enemy fighter attack plane, because we wiped out that capability before we moved the soft bodies in, before we moved in personnel, whether it's the Army or the Marine Corps. So we always dominated the battlefield by air early, and they were very proud. We've always heard the proud statement from the Air Force that we never had a civilian or never had a troop killed by enemy aircraft from like 1949 forward. So that was a truism that we've always insisted on, and we've developed air superiority before we moved the personnel in. So that's something that they don't have in Ukraine. Bobby, do you think they're going to come to that conclusion that's going to leave Russia with essentially
They're going to have the
a de facto
F-16s.
piece of Ukraine, of that Ukraine border?
The Ukrainians are going to get F-16s, but I would like to ask Bobby, how do you think Ukraine ends, Dr. Hunter? What do you think happens in the very end?
I think what happens in Ukraine depends on whether or not we give the Ukrainians enough flexibility and enough support that they can get whatever they need to prevail. And if we don't, they'll lose in the long run.
Well, the one thing the Russians camp on these conflicts. In the last 100 years, the communists have shown that the one thing that they have is durability,
Stick-to-itiveness.
and they believe strongly that the democracies ultimately, wars become unpopular in democracies, and people protest and make that point clear to their legislators, and they leave the war. And at that point, whether it's a Korea that ends in a stalemate, or a Vietnam that ends with the northern divisions moving to Saigon, at that point the communists prevail. I think that that they're following that template, if you will. They say that Putin has lost 90% of the original invading force that he invaded with. However, that hasn't bothered him any. He's restocked his military with more bodies, with more personnel, some of them very poorly trained, but he doesn't care. And as I understand it, now, Bobby, you said that his industrial base is improving to some degree. He's strengthening his defense industrial base, which is now turning out more munitions than it did before.
Yes, they, for example, are building a big new factory to make mini drones.
To make what?
And they're also importing munitions from other
Mini
parts
drones.
of their allies, such as North Korea, which is not an area subject to attack. And furthermore, we've accepted that we are not attacking inside of Russia. So what's happened in effect is the one instrument we had, which was the Air Force, to really deal with the Russians in Europe, has been entirely sidelined. So my point in the end is the following: people like the Ukrainians will fight, and they won't be subject to the same kinds of constraints like the anti-war demonstrators and people like that can produce over here. I think they will fight to defend their homeland. And if you give them enough resources to buy what they need to do that and to develop what they need to do that, I think they will prevail. If you fail to give them enough resources, in the end, they will have a very hard time. And, you're seeing their actual operations now coupled into the funding cycles inside of Capitol Hill, which has come down to these one-year things. They don't have a long-term commitment, and they don't have the flexibility to develop or to buy what they really want. So I think that's the situation you're in.
And you know what, too? It's expensive, right? The European Union's going to give they're trying to give $54 billion to Ukraine just to prop up their statehood.
Yeah.
That's not for artillery shells, not for ammo, not for planes, not for tanks. That's just so people pick up trash, on Tuesdays, and potholes are fixed in the streets, and the currency stays valued, right? So there's a lot of money going in. War nowadays in a first world country or a second world country is expensive.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
And a lot of our money's going now to non-lethal aid.
To propping up the state because it has to exist. And when I was there a few months ago, they still don't look like they're on war footing. There's still 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds in the bars, in the restaurants, in the city. The average age of the Ukrainian military man is now 43 years old. 43.
Really?
That's incredible. The average age in the U.S. military is probably around 20.
Yeah.
Maybe 21 or something, because we got lots of 18-year-olds, and they start dropping out as it goes on. Guys like me and you get out early.
Yeah. Now you took communications gear, and you actually physically, because you didn't trust the means of transport and the bureaucracy, you actually physically drove this across Ukraine to Kiev and delivered it personally to the military in Kiev, to the military leadership there. Now, when you did that, then you were back after that. And
I took satellite phones to the border guards in Lviv. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Not all the way to Kiev. I just went to Kiev this last time, two months ago.
Okay.
But last year it was just Lviv and out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, what did you see? So you were in the two trips.
Yeah.
How many months separated the trips?
About a year.
Any difference in the damage done to the country?
No. In fact, people have gotten used to it. There's more people out and about. There's people on the streets. There's people going out to eat. It's like, people adapt to things very quickly. And in any wartime situation, all right? The Israelis have had to adapt to the Gazans perpetrating terror on them for years now, right? We in San Diego and in the southern United States have to deal with people south of us from South and Central America coming up and perpetrating violence on us here too.
Yeah, we've got, so Bob, that takes us to another thing that you probably aren't as focused on, but that's The southern border, I was told by one source the other day that 10,000 people a day are coming across that border, meaning you know, in the Marine Corps is 172,000 people or so, between 170 and 177 on any given month. And that means that in 20 days, you have the equivalent of a United States Marine Corps moving across that southern border into the United States, being dispersed into our cities. We've turned the Border Patrol into an administrative group that brings these folks in and in most cases simply releases them. They're so-called paroled into the country with a notice requirement that at some point in the future they're going to need to show up for a hearing. So those people are going to pull the economy to some degree. When you see them coming in those massive numbers, and you see those crowds, they appear to have no visible means of support. So if you turn to the American taxpayer and say who's going to support these folks, it's going to be the American taxpayer, and he's going to pay for them either with his taxes or in some cases, if he's a working American, with his job, because those young military age men are going to be doing plastering, they're going to be doing carpentry, they're going to be going into jobs, probably legally or illegally, that Americans were doing before that. And that's going to put, I think, a drag, in my estimation, it's going to put a drag on our economy. I think it's already putting a drag on the economy. So you've got this tug of war in Congress right now, this deadlock. The president wants money for Ukraine and Israel. We do too, but we want it also. We want it shifted to items of leverage. And Bob, as you said, you want to give them some say in what kind of leverage items they need. But the other thing we need is support for our own border, and we probably need to have an operational pause and letting anybody come across, so we have a chance
Duncan,
to sort people out.
let me point something at you about the border. If the Border Patrol has turned into an administrative arm, then you're left with, well, we can sort of try these high-tech things. Now, the Israelis relied on high-tech things to keep Gaza in check. And I think Hamas was able to knock out their high-end stuff.
Well, they used a bulldozer to go through the fence.
Well, exactly, but they've knocked out the high-end camera networks and all that stuff that people relied on.
Yeah.
So I think one point you have to understand is once the Border Patrol becomes a sort of an administrative arm, then you may not have the ability to actually impose a stoppage of the flow across the border. So you've got to ask yourself what level you need to even maintain the capability that if you wanted to, you could stop the southern border influx of people.
You need an obstacle, and in San Diego, that was the double border fence that we built in the 1990s. And I'll just give you one statistic. In 1990, when I started building the double fence between San Diego and Tijuana, we had 205,000 apprehensions. After we'd finished the fence with only one hole in the fence where you had a historic site, that dropped down to 9,000. So we went from 205,000 to 9,000, more than a 95% reduction in people and drugs coming across. We stopped all the drug trucks from coming across. So having obstacles at the border, that is a double fence, two fences with a high-speed road in between, does work in the absence of somebody who can pole vault 100 yards because you've got a big space in between. So fences work. The problem for the Israelis is when their fence was knocked down by a skip loader, bulldozer, whatever, when that occurred, I saw, at least in the videos that I saw, there was no reaction force to meet the Hamas fighters as they poured in.
Well, that's what I was trying to say, Doc. Again, if the Border Patrol is now an administrative arm, and you don't have a fence across the entire border in any case, it's not clear to me that if you really faced a major influx, you could even strongly curtail it. I think you all have a good idea as to the sort of common elements, and what you're really seeing in these other countries like Israel and Ukraine is perhaps a shift where you're relying on these countries to conduct their own defenses. And that's new, where we can't do everything. And so we have to think through the complications arising from the Russian, say, nuclear threat, the effect it's having on our supply of weaponry. Like Little Dunk said, basically they don't have any air cover. And secondly, it also has an effect on the country itself. And you're going to see that kind of thing, I think, get larger and larger. And then you're faced with the control of the southern border still being possible in this country. So I think you've got really good topics here. And I do think there's a common theme. And I commend you for your efforts to try to put together a coherent picture as to how you deal with these three separate situations.
Hey, Bob,
Okay.
listen, hey, thanks for all you do. We know you're working on your fusion program, and thanks for the great work you've done on lasers, and the great service you've rendered to our national security over the many years from the time you were with the Reagan administration.
It's always easy to be an armchair R&D guy in the back line, Dunk. It's very heroic.
Okay.
However, Dunk, you were a ground soldier in Vietnam, and Duncan D., you were a ground soldier in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So I think you guys have the best knowledge of what's actually needed here, that we're reverting back to forms of warfare that are in some sense more primitive than we had hoped for.
Yeah. Well, I think Duncan made the big point here, which is air power. I'm just trying to figure out if the Ukrainians want air power, so we've given them some, but we haven't given them air superiority, and that's going to be massively expensive to move that to them. So Duncan, what do you think we can supplement
Bobby
aircraft?
was about to freeze to death with no phone. Are we going to let him go? or
Hey,
are we
Bob,
still
we're gonna let you
talking
go.
with him? What are we doing?
Yeah, let me go, and you guys can figure out what you can do. You're closer to this than I am, and I commend your efforts to try to find some solutions here.
Okay. Hey, go back into the steakhouse and have another one on us.
Well, I'm going to tell you the story. They locked the door.
Okay. In that case, take a cab to your hotel.
I'm going to try if my battery holds out.
Okay, we'll see you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
You know what really gets me with Ukraine is we're going to give the Ukrainians F-16s, right? Joe Biden is going to give the Ukrainians F-16s.
How many?
I don't know, but the Ukrainian pilots are being trained now, and other countries will be allowed to give them F-16s once they have trained pilots 2 years later. I mean, that's got to really get you, right? I mean, if you're a Ukrainian and you've been fighting and you asked for this and they said, no, there's no way, and you see tens of thousands of your countrymen die, and then they come in late, because in the beginning we thought that the Russians might drop a nuke on San Diego or something. So we've progressively said no to so many things and then given them those things, slow rolled out, and it's hard not to be a conspiracy theorist. How do you not put a conspiracy to, if the Ukrainians would have had F-16s a year ago, they would have had a massive forward push, and they would have at least been able to push the Russians out of the east or out of Crimea, or at least push them back a bit. But we didn't give them to them. Their counteroffensive totally fumbled, but they're going to get the airplanes next year, in just a few months. Right? That's got to really burn them, and that's happened with everything.
Yeah.
With lots of gear, I think, going from the Javelin, the ATACMS, right? Those came out after the U.S. said no. You can't have the ATACMS. Those are the artillery bomblets. We have done this with, quite a bit of stuff. Anyway, I think it would be hard to be a Ukrainian and not be really angry. But how can you be angry when your entire country is propped up by the United States at the same time?
Yeah.
Right? It'd be like having to live with your in-laws who are extremely wealthy, but you don't really like them that much. Right?
Yeah.
You have to be nice to them.
Yeah. Well, and Zelensky looked like he's this is worn on him.
Well, it's probably it's politically he's at the end of his rope too.
Yeah.
Some polls just recently showed that he's at the same popularity as his top general, who hasn't announced any want to go into politics to run against him. But Zelensky, it's interesting. You can look at this thing from so many sides. Zelensky doesn't allow men to leave his country. Putin doesn't allow men to leave his country. They're going to have to really crack down recruiting Ukrainians because people are dodging the draft, right?
Yeah.
They're not going to have elections in Ukraine. So
Really?
they're under martial law because Zelensky said you can't have elections when all the Ukrainian diaspora, everybody's spread out. There's millions of Ukrainians in Germany and Poland and Ireland and all spread out, which is totally true. But his political opponents are taking advantage of this. So if you lose Zelensky, then what do you have? Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, everything's
You know what
everything's
this shows?
complicated.
It shows that none of these things come wrapped in neat packages. But you've got one thing with Ukraine that we haven't had with Vietnam, for example, certainly Afghanistan, and that is a defender who is energized and who will fight to the death. And I'm talking about a lot of the Ukrainians, not the ones that left, but who will fight to the death to avoid being taken over by Russia. You know, once you've been in communism and you've been in the box and you get out, it's hard to get you back into the box.
Yep.
And so we have a defender. This isn't Afghanistan where we're leaving $80 billion worth of equipment with an army that folded and in a very short time against fairly moderate opposition, military opposition. Here you got the Ukrainians willing to fight. We got a lot of technology, we got a lot of weapons, and we got some money, and so do the Allies. And the Allies ought to really step up.
Yeah, the Europeans have to step up. And I've been thinking about this. What can they do? If they're not going to send in troops, they don't have the economy of the United States. They don't have the economy of California, for goodness sake, right? Germany's under a massive economic contraction right now because China's not buying German goods, right? Believe it or
Right.
not. So what are the Europeans really going to do if they're not going to send people? They don't have enough gear because they've been massively undercutting their defense budgets for decades now. So
By relying on us.
by relying on us. So the Europeans don't have a big backlog of stores of supplies. They don't have the same economy that the United States has. They can't borrow money or print dollars like the United States can. I don't know what they can really do unless they're going to send in people, send in units to help the Ukrainians out. There's not much more they can do, especially when you got guys like Orban in Hungary. You have these outliers in the European Union that can stop everything. It just takes one vote to stop the whole thing. That's what Russia does in the UN, right?
Yeah, and there's no
UN
regulations.
Security Council. So
Yeah.
I just don't know how the Europeans are really going to help Ukraine. It's going to come down, like Uncle Bobby said, to money and to being able to buy the Ukrainians what they need. I don't think the American people will go for us giving Ukraine money and then saying, hey, I hope you spend this well, while I go and pay for groceries triple what they cost 2 years ago, right? That's not a good thing. So I don't think you're going to be able to give the Ukrainians money. You got to find somebody smart in the U.S. that can work with them and try to buy them the right things, which I think is what's happening right now too, right?
Yeah. Well, what if we have a team that engages with them from DOD that
But
says,
we have that now, right?
but obviously they want air power, right?
Yeah.
And we got to get it to them. That's the problem with developing air power. That's been our strength and a blessing in many cases where we fought other nations and they couldn't develop an air power quickly to match us, right? Because air power does take a long time to develop. But Europe has compositely roughly our GNP. They're roughly as big as the United States altogether, right? They could do more. And interestingly, they did more under Trump when he beat them up, when he would jawbone them and get after them. That worked to some degree because they no European congressman goes back to his people and says, it looks at his polls and says, I want to be more popular. I'm going to give money to NATO operations, right? You don't get popularity by giving money to NATO operations. So these guys all relied on Uncle Sugar. That was us. And the rules of NATO are very thin. it's like when you go to the potluck dinner and you bring the steak dinner and your brother-in-law brings the plastic forks, and it always works out that way. Europe always brings the plastic forks. When we run a lot of our operations, like we did in the Balkans, ones that we ran in Iraq where Europeans were helping us, we typically would pay for 65, 70% of all the air operations, which are the expensive operations. They would come in compositely with a fraction of what we came in with. Now they need to step up.
I don't know.
We got to put some pressure on them.
Maybe Europe has a 2,000-year-old mindset, because when we say Europe, we mean all these disparate countries, different languages, different backgrounds, different histories, ancestries, everything. That's why they'll never be the United States. That's why the European Union can't be the United States. They don't share language, they don't share culture, etc. But I don't think that they have the ability to transform themselves into a cohesive unit to support Ukraine. I just don't.
Well, it's called NATO.
Yeah.
They can send, but you're right.
But NATO's fairly worthless, and I'll tell you what, I think it's disingenuous for them to even offer the NATO opportunity to Ukraine. I don't think there's any chance that NATO would allow a country in that could trigger Article 5. I don't think there's any chance.
Yeah.
Right? The European Union bloc is different. I don't think that there's a chance that they get into NATO.
Article 5 says your enemy is our enemy,
Yeah.
and we're going to take on the Russians militarily directly if they attack a NATO member.
And they're under attack, so that would trigger it immediately, right?
Absolutely.
Would the American people like that? We'd probably, I don't know. The world's a complex place, especially Israel. I mean, Israel and Gaza, that's that goes back a long way too.
Yeah.
A few thousand years,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Israel is fighting house to house in Gaza,
Yeah.
and they're taking casualties. They're taking these infantry casualties.
Yeah, it's
these
massively
tough
hard. So
Yeah.
you can see why the Israelis have to bomb discriminately, because going house to house, it's brutal. You're in a 3D environment. You have to worry about the underground, which we've heard so much about. But even if you're not Hamas, digging underground, you have underground sewers in cities. So you have this basement subterranean level, then you have your ground level, then you have up above you, you have 360 that you have to watch out for. You have to watch out in 360 degrees, and to top it all off, the guys that are in front of you shooting at you can hide their AK, run around, and stand by their door with a cell phone and wave hi at you while you walk by, and you wouldn't know it because they're not wearing uniforms.
Yeah.
Right, so it's a really hard fight when you're fighting maniacal Muslims in Gaza, and you're looking. I mean, it's a really tough fight, and the Israelis are probably going to take a lot more casualties, and this is going to make them drop more bombs discriminately, but still end up with a lot of casualties that the world does not want to see right now, and it's really hurting the Israelis.
Yeah. So what happens? You go into a house. You stack on the door. First man goes in. He goes down. There's 3 guys in there with an AK, with AKs. They take down the first man, maybe wound the second. After that's happened in a building, as happened in Fallujah, you pull out and you hit it with artillery fire or with aircraft fire, and so it's a real tough balance to keep, because by being discriminate, you lose some of your own people, right? You're putting your infantry into those houses. And anyway, Israel's doing that right now. This one blurb that came from the Institute for the Study of War that described the casualties being taken by the squad that got ambushed by Hamas, going in house to house, and the extraction people, the reaction force, also got hit very heavily, and that's probably only one of many firefights and occurrences that have gone on over the last several days.
Right. Think about this too. Beyond all the things that I just said, you also have to hold the houses that you've secured, that you've taken. So after you clear a house with the guys with the AKs inside, if you don't shoot it with the tank or drop a bomb on it, you got to hold it, or the bad guys will sneak in behind you. Because remember, you're just fighting civilians that are terrorists but look like civilians.
Yeah.
Right? You cannot tell who is who until they shoot at you. right? And that's one thing that we had the rules of engagement in Iraq and Afghanistan. You had to get shot at first before you could fire back or think that you were under threat. But when you're walking through a city like Gaza, you're always under threat because the bad guys are going behind you, under you. They're up in buildings over you. They're looking down. You don't know the area, even though you've probably studied a satellite map for days and days, as well as they do. It's just going to be a really hard slog, and it's probably going to make them keep bombing.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah. Well, so the world doesn't come wrapped in a neat package, but it's almost Christmas.
And we're in San Diego.
We're in San Diego, and it's a wonderful life. So I did see a Frank Capra movie it was called Pocket Full of Miracles. That's one of his uplifting movies.
I've never heard of Frank Capra.
Frank Capra did It's a Wonderful Life, starring Jimmy
I've seen
Stewart.
that,
Yeah, yeah.
I just finished season 3 of The Wire, which for some reason I never watched on HBO, so I just am binging The Wire through Christmas. Thanks for joining us. I'm Duncan Hunter.
And I'm Duncan Hunter.
We hope to see you next time.